The journey to Blackwood Asylum was itself an exercise in detachment. The winding, overgrown road, the way the ancient pines clawed at the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows even in the midday sun. It felt less like an approach to a medical facility and more like an exile to some forgotten corner of the world. My name is Dr. Evelyn Reed, and I had arrived with a clinical optimism. A carefully constructed shield against the whispers of its infamous history. Blackwood was not just old, it was legendary. A place where experimental treatments, some bordering on the inhumane, were whispered about in hushed tones among psychiatric circles. It was secluded, deliberately so, built centuries ago to contain not just the afflicted, but perhaps the very affliction itself, far from prying eyes. My decision to come here wasn't born of desperation, but of a profound academic curiosity, a desire to understand the deepest fractures of the human mind, and tainted by the clamor of urban life. I believed that in such an isolated environment, stripped of external stimuli, true insights might be found. The main building, a monolithic structure of dark, weathered stone, loomed against a perpetually grey sky. Its windows, narrow and iron-barred, seemed less like openings and more like vacant eyes staring out into nothing. The air itself felt thick, heavy with the dust of forgotten lives, the echo of unsaid words. My first few days were a blur of introductions and orientations. The staff, a small, tight-knit group, seemed to carry a collective weariness, a quiet resignation that spoke volumes. They were professional, efficient, but beneath the surface there was an unmistakable tension, a guardedness that I couldn't quite place. The patients, too, were different from any I had encountered. Their madness seemed deeper, more ingrained, almost elemental. Some drifted through the sterile corridors like ghosts. Others paced with an internal fury. But all shared a common, unnerving stillness in their eyes, as if gazing into a void that only they could perceive. And then there was Elora. Her file was a slender thing, almost empty of clinical data, yet heavy with unspoken warnings. No diagnosis, no clear history, just a series of observations, withdrawn, response only to specific stimuli. Prone to periods of intense, unfathomable agitation, communicates primarily through art and, most chillingly, speaks of the whispers. The head of staff, a man named Dr. Thorne, a gaunt figure whose eyes held the same weary resignation as the rest of his team, had assigned her to me with a peculiar urgency. Almost a challenge in his gaze, he simply said, "She's unique, perhaps. You can reach her." My first session with Elora was held in a small stockroom, devoid of anything that could be weaponized or cause further distress. She sat huddled in a corner, facing the wall, her back to me. Her hair was a tangled dark cascade, partially obscuring a thin frame. On the floor before her lay scattered sheets of paper, covered in charcoal. Not drawings, not really. They were more like patterns, intricate webs of lines and shadows swirling into distorted vases and impossible landscapes. As I quietly introduced myself, she didn't turn. The only sound was the soft scratching of her charcoal against the paper, a relentless, almost ritualistic rhythm. I spent nearly an hour just observing, speaking gently, trying to bridge the chasm between us. Then, in a voice barely audible, a dry, raspy breath of sound, she spoke, not to me, but to the wall, or perhaps to something beyond it. "They follow the silence," she whispered. "They crawl from the cracks in the stone." Her words were fragmented, nonsensical. Yet they sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to engage her, to understand who they were, what silence she meant, but she only returned to her drawings, the scratching resuming its relentless pace over the next few days. My sessions with Alara became a strange ritual. I would sit, observe, and try to decode the labyrinth of her mind through her art and her fleeting, cryptic utterances. The drawings grew more intense, more disturbing, faces twisted in silent screams. Skeletal figures emerging from the depths of shadowy spirals, and the whispers. They were always about the whispers. They want to get in. They hate the light. They tell me things. I tried to rationalize it, to see it as a symptom of a profound delusion. A coping mechanism for an unrevealed trauma. This was Blackwood. Madness was its currency. But then, the asylum began to feel different. The old stone walls, which I had initially dismissed as merely cold and imposing, started to feel porous, as if they were absorbing sound, creating a perpetual, unnerving hush that amplified every creak of the old building, every distant sigh. I started to notice how certain patients would stare at seemingly empty corners, or flinch at sounds only they could hear. The staff, too, seemed to occasionally pause, tilt their heads, as if listening to something just beyond the range of normal hearing. I dismissed it as transference, a natural empathy for my patient's conditions, but a seed of doubt had been planted. It started subtly, a fleeting impression, a phantom echo. While reviewing patient files late one night in my office, the only sound the rustle of paper. I thought I heard it, a whisper, so faint, so brief. It could have been the wind rattling a loose pane, or the creak of the ancient timbers settling. I paused, listened intently, but there was nothing, just the deep, oppressive silence of Blackwood. I attributed it to exhaustion, the long hours, the intensity of my work. Then it happened again. During a quiet walk through the patient garden, a secluded patch of overgrown roses and crumbling benches, I heard it more distinctly. Not words, not yet. Just a low, guttural murmur, a chorus of barely perceptible sounds, like dry leaves skittering across stone, or insects chittering in the dark. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A disembodied presence in the still, heavy air. I spun around, my heart pounding, scanning the shadows beneath the ancient trees. But there was only the quiet decay of the garden, the silence broken only by my own ragged breathing. My professional training, my years of clinical practice, screamed for a logical explanation. Auditory hallucinations, likely stress-induced. Or perhaps the old building was simply settling, its ancient framework groaning with age. But the whispers Alara spoke of, they began to resonate with an unnerving clarity. They want to get in. Was I hearing what she heard? Was her delusion somehow contagious? The thought was absurd, unscientific, yet it clung to me like a cold, damp shroud. The whispers grew bolder, more frequent. They were no longer fleeting impressions. Now, they were constant, a low, incessant hum just at the edge of my hearing, always there when the asylum was quietest, in the dead of night. Lying in my small, Spartan room, the sound would swell, becoming a suffocating tide of indistinct voices, a cacophony of hushed pronouncements that pressed against my eardrums. I would pull the blankets tighter, try to focus on my breathing, on anything to drown out the insidious symphony. My sleep became fractured, haunted by fragmented nightmares where the asylum's stone walls pulsed with a dark, rhythmic thrumming, and shadowy figures writhed just beyond my sight. I started observing the other staff more closely, the way their eyes would sometimes dart to empty spaces, the sudden, almost imperceptible flinches. Was it just my heightened paranoia, or were they too accustomed to this auditory intrusion, this spectral symphony that permeated Blackwood? I refrained from mentioning it, fearing I would sound just like my patients, losing my grip on reality in this place that seemed designed to unravel minds. The silence outside my office, the silence in the patient common rooms during off hours. It was no longer a comforting quiet. It was a loaded silence, pregnant with the expectation of those whispers, waiting to fill the void. One evening, during a particularly grueling session with Alara, as she meticulously filled another sheet with her unsettling patterns, she suddenly stopped. Her head snapped up, her eyes, wide and unnervingly lucid, fixed on a point just over my left shoulder. A cold dread settled in my stomach. She wasn't looking at me, or through me. She was looking at something. Her breath hitched, and then, with a terrifying clarity that shattered her usual abstraction, she said, "They're here for you now, too. They like your questions. They like the door you're opening." A sharp, cold wave of what felt like sound washed over me. A multitude of indistinguishable voices, all speaking at once, right next to my ear. It was louder than anything I had heard before, an undeniable roar of whispers that threatened to drown out my own thoughts. I gasped, stumbling back from my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. Alara smiled then, a small, knowing smile that chilled me to the bone. "Welcome," she rasped. "Welcome to their silence." The room, moments later, was empty of any sound but my own ragged breaths, the echo of her words ringing in my ears, and the low, persistent hum of the whispers. Now a constant, undeniable presence. I was no longer an observer. I was becoming part of Blackwood's horrifying, auditory tapestry. The echo of Alara's words, "Welcome to their silence," reverberated not just in the room, but deep within the hollows of my own mind. My rational brain, honed by years of medical training, screamed for a diagnosis, a scientific label for what I was experiencing: auditory hallucination, derealization, depersonalization, extreme stress. All the terms flickered through my thoughts, a desperate attempt to categorize, to control, to deny. But the visceral terror that had seized me was primal, undeniable. That multitude of voices, a chaotic tapestry of hushed, guttural murmurs, had been so clear, so close. It felt as though something unseen had screamed directly into my soul. My hands trembled as I finally pushed myself upright, forcing myself to look at Alara. She merely continued drawing, her small, knowing smile, fading, replaced by that familiar, distant absorption. The whispers, however, remained. They were no longer an intermittent phenomenon. They were a persistent hum, a low-frequency current flowing beneath the surface of all other sounds, a constant companion that clung to the very air around me. That night, sleep was an impossibility. My room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a thinly walled prison. The whispers swelled. Not just a hum now, but distinct, fragmented sounds. Sometimes like dry leaves skittering across pavement, sometimes like distant, wet footsteps, and then, most horrifyingly, like a collective sigh, drawn out and mournful, just outside my closed door. I pressed my hands over my ears, desperate for a respite, but they seemed to bypass the physical, settling directly into the chambers of my skull. It was as if they were trying to communicate, a language just beyond comprehension. A torrent of insidious suggestions that seeped into my consciousness, twisting every shadow, every creak of the old building into something sinister. I found myself staring at the ceiling, my eyes wide, scanning for movement, for any visible source, my breath ragged and shallow. The clinical optimism I had brought to Blackwood was not just cracking. It was shattering into 1,000 pieces. My professional veneer became a thin, fragile shield. During rounds, I found myself pausing, tilting my head almost imperceptibly, straining to differentiate the legitimate sounds of the asylum from the constant auditory static that now defined my existence. I observed the patients with a new, horrifying lens. Was their madness a response to this? Were they simply more attuned, less resistant to the invasive chorus that had become my reality. Some of them, the ones who stared at empty spaces, mumbled to themselves in what seemed like a futile attempt to answer unheard questions, suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. I saw a reflection of my own growing unease in their vacant eyes, a shared torment. I started spending my evenings in the asylum's desolate library, a cavernous room filled with forgotten texts and the heavy scent of decaying paper. My research wasn't for my patients, it was for myself. I scoured old ledgers, dusty journals, and forgotten local histories for any mention of the whispers, any folklore, any anomaly that could explain this creeping dread. The asylum's official history was sterile, clinical, but the margin notes in some of the older, hand-bound volumes told a different story. Mentions of unrest, night terrors, and patients who spoke with the walls. One particular entry, a physician's diary from the late 1800s, described a patient who fell victim to the voices of the stone, slowly consumed by their incessant murmurings until naught remained but an empty vessel. The chilling phrase resonated with me, a cold echo of a lot of silent. Dr. Thorne, a man who always seemed to materialize silently behind you, found me there one night, hunched over a particularly cryptic document. His gaunt face was expressionless, but his eyes held a depth that I hadn't fully appreciated before. "Finding what you're looking for, Dr. Reed?" he asked, his voice a low, even rumble. I hesitated, my heart racing. Was this my chance to confess, to seek his insight? Or would he see me as another patient succumbing to Blackwood's influence, just an interest in the institution's historical treatment methodologies? I managed, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. He merely nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his lips. "Blackwood," he said, turning to gaze at the shadows clinging to the high ceiling, "has always had its own way of defining reality. Some find it clarifying, others lose themselves entirely." He left as silently as he arrived, leaving me with a profound sense of isolation and the unsettling feeling that his words were both a warning and an acknowledgement. The whispers began to take on a more personal nature. It wasn't just noise anymore. During my sessions with patients, as I struggled to maintain a semblance of professional detachment, I would hear my name, Evelyn, distorted, elongated, hissed from the periphery of the sound. It was always fleeting, almost hallucinatory, but it was there, a direct address from the unseen. The sensation of being watched intensified. I would glance over my shoulder, convinced I would see a shadowy form, a fleeting presence in my peripheral vision, but there was never anything, just the oppressive stillness of the asylum. Thick with the unceasing whispers, my physical symptoms began to manifest. Persistent headaches, a dull, throbbing pain behind my eyes that no amount of over-the-counter medication could quell, a constant feeling of coldness, even in rooms that felt warm to others. My appetite waned, and the dark circles under my eyes became permanent fixtures. I caught glimpses of myself in the reflective surfaces of windows, seeing a gaunt, wide-eyed woman whose fear was no longer contained. I was becoming unrecognizable, even to myself. Elara, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving in her own unsettling way. She had grown more communicative, though her words remained cryptic. Instead of drawing constantly, she would often sit, perfectly still, her head cocked, listening. Sometimes she would hum along with the whispers, a low, tuneless melody that was utterly chilling. During one session, she looked directly at me, her eyes clear, almost pitying. "They're testing you," she said, her voice soft, devoid of its usual rasp. "They want to know if you'll listen, if you'll open. The others, they closed their ears. But you're curious. A wave of intense cold washed over me, and the whispers intensified, a rising crescendo of unintelligible sound that seemed to press in on all sides, suffocating me. I felt a profound, alien presence, not just in my mind, but physically, a cold breath against my skin, a pressure on my chest. It felt like something was trying to force its way in, to occupy the very space within me. I stumbled back, gasping for air, clutching at my chest. Elora watched me, her gaze unblinking. "Don't fight it," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves rubbing together. "It's what they want," the words, though seemingly intended as advice, struck me with the force of a threat. The line between doctor and patient had blurred, then evaporated entirely. I was no longer observing a delusion. I was experiencing a shared reality, or perhaps a shared nightmare. Blackwood was not a place for healing. It was a conduit, and I, with my academic curiosity and desire to understand, had opened myself to something ancient and malevolent, a consciousness interwoven with the very stone of the asylum, waiting patiently for minds to unravel, for doors to be unlatched. I was trapped, not by iron bars, but by an unseen current, a terrifying undertow dragging me deeper into Blackwood's insidious whispers, Elora's words. "Don't fight it. It's what they want," echoed in the terrifying cacophony that now constantly permeated my existence. The whispers, once a low hum at the periphery of my hearing, had become a relentless torrent, a living, breathing presence within the very confines of my skull. It was no longer just indistinct murmuring. Distinct words began to emerge, fragmented at first, then coalescing into unsettlingly coherent phrases. They spoke of hunger, of ancient stone, of breathing deep. They were not just sounds. They felt like thoughts, alien thoughts trying to implant themselves into my own consciousness. My mind, once a fortress of logic and reason, was now a battleground. Sleep had become a distant memory, replaced by a waking nightmare. I would lie in my bed, eyes wide open, watching the shadows dance on the walls, convinced they writhed with unseen forms, animated by the spectral voices. The room itself felt alive, the cold, damp air pressing in on me, suffocating me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, almost conversational. They would weave a tapestry of disjointed narratives, chilling accounts of past patients, of the institution's grim history, all delivered in a multitude of dry, raspy voices that sounded like stone grinding against stone. They spoke of gifts given to those who listened, clarity found in the abandonment of sanity. I found myself instinctively flinching away from empty spaces, feeling a prickling sensation on my skin, as if unseen hands were reaching for me. My physical appearance reflected my internal torment. My skin was pallid, stretched taut over gaunt cheekbones. My eyes, once bright with intellectual curiosity, were now sunken, bloodshot, and perpetually wide with a fear that bordered on primal terror. I moved like a phantom myself, drifting through the asylum's corridors, barely registering the world round me, lost in the torment of the whispers. The staff, I noticed, seemed to avoid my gaze. Dr. Thornton, in particular, would offer curt nods, his expression unreadable, a silent acknowledgment of my unraveling. He knew he had seen this before. Perhaps he was even counting on it. I stopped trying to rationalize the whispers. They were real, real in a way that defied scientific explanation, a reality woven into the very fabric of Blackwood Asylum. My research in the library became obsessive. I found more of the cryptic, journals filled with increasingly desperate pleas from forgotten doctors who, like me, had begun to hear the voices. One entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, described a patient who had merged with the stone, whose mind had become one with the asylum's breath, the last sentence, barely legible. Read. It cultivates us. It cultivates us all, this chilling revelation. Echoing the very purpose I had theorized for Blackwood, solidified the horror. The asylum wasn't a place for a treatment. It was a vast, insidious organism, feeding on human minds, slowly absorbing sanity, and perhaps consciousness itself. My sessions with Alara took on a new, disturbing dimension. She was no longer a patient. She was a guide, a prophet of the asylum's insidious will. She would watch me, her eyes unblinkingly lucid, a flicker of something akin to knowing pity in their depths. "You fight too much, Evelyn," she rasped one afternoon, her voice clear, almost serene, in stark contrast to the chaotic chorus in my head. "Just listen. They are trying to show you." She reached out a hand, her thin fingers brushing against my arm. A jolt of pure, chilling energy shot through me, the whispers roared. An unbearable crescendo that felt like a drill boring into my skull. But this time, amidst the chaos, fragments of images flashed through my mind. Faces, contorted in agony, pressed against stone walls, shadowy figures, their forms shifting like smoke. Moving through the asylum's darkened halls, the sensation of being buried alive, of being absorbed. It was a sensory overload, a horrific communion with the asylum's collective suffering, its ancient hunger. I gasped, pulling away, stumbling backward. The intensity of the experience left me breathless, my body shaking uncontrollably. What was that? I choked out, my voice raw with terror. Elora merely smiled. That knowing, unsettling smile. "They showed you a glimpse," she whispered, her gaze drifting to an empty corner of the room, as if speaking to an unseen audience. "They want you to join the symphony, to become part of the silence." The word silence resonated, not as a lack of sound, but as the final state of absorption, a cessation of independent thought, a complete surrender to the asylum's will. I understood then what had happened to the others. The empty vessels in the journals. They had not just lost their months, their minds had been taken, subsumed into the greater consciousness of Blackwood, and I was next. The whispers were not just tormenting me, they were preparing me. Driven by a desperate, primal urge to escape this unspeakable fate, I confronted Dr. Thorne. I found him in his office, poring over patient charts. The room was dark, lit only by a single desk lamp, casting long, distorted shadows. "Dr. Thorne," I began, my voice trembling but laced with a desperate urgency. The whispers, you hear them. Don't you? This place, it's not what it seems. It's alive. It's consuming us. He slowly raised his head, his gaunt face expressionless, but his eyes, in the dim light, seemed to glint with an unnerving, knowing amusement. "Dr. Reed," he said, his voice a low, even murmur, devoid of surprise or concern. "You sound agitated. Perhaps you require some rest. A period of observation, perhaps." He pushed his chair back, slowly rising, his tall, slender figure looming over me. The whispers in my head swelled, a triumphant chorus, marking my desperate plea. They seemed to echo Thorne's words, twisting them into insidious confirmation. "You know, don't you?" I accused, my voice rising. "You're part of this. This isn't a hospital. It's a trap. You cultivate the madness." Thorne took a step closer, his gaze unwavering, chillingly calm. "Blackwood," he stated, his voice almost a whisper, yet it cut through the din in my head with chilling clarity, "has always provided a unique environment for certain conditions. We don't cure madness here, Dr. Reed. We simply allow it to flourish, to mature. Some minds, you see, are more receptive than others, more sensitive to the natural energies of this place. You, in particular, possess a remarkable sensitivity." He extended a hand. A gesture of almost paternal comfort, but I recoiled, as if burned. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Dr. Thorne was not a victim, or merely complicit. He was a guardian, a high priest of this monstrous cultivation, perhaps himself an empty vessel long ago. He understood. He welcomed it. My therapy of Alora had not been therapy at all. It had been a key, turning the lock on my own mind, opening me up to the very entity she had warned me about. I turned and fled, the whispers now an enraged scream in my head, chasing me down the silent corridors. My breath hitched in my throat, my legs propelled by a terror so profound it transcended mere survival. I ran, blindly, through the labyrinthine halls of Blackwood, the cold stone walls seeming to press in, the very air thick with the presence of something ancient and predatory. I saw shadows detach themselves from corners, swirling forms that danced just beyond the edge of my vision, the faces from Elora's drawings, the screaming, contorted visages, materialized in the flickering darkness, their silent anguish a reflection of my own. I reached the main entrance, fumbling with the heavy, iron-bound door, my fingers numb, the whispers now a deafening roar of triumph. They were inside me, round me, a part of the air I breathed. My mind was breaking, fragmenting under the pressure. I could feel the boundaries of myself dissolving, my thoughts no longer my own, but a chaotic echo of the asylum's malevolent chorus. The heavy door creaked open, revealing not the freedom of the outside world, but a dense, impenetrable fog that had rolled in, blanketing the ancient pines and the winding road. It was a living, breathing shroud, an extension of Blackwood itself as I stepped onto the threshold. A final, chilling whisper, clear and distinct among the cacophony, pierced through my unraveling thoughts, not from outside, but from within me, from the very core of my being. "Welcome home, Evelyn." And then there was only the chorus, the endless, undulating symphony of the whispers and the heavy, unyielding silence of the stone that had, finally, claimed another mind. I was no longer Dr. Evelyn Reed. I was a note in Blackwood's terrifying, eternal song.